Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using the Intel B580. We're using the Intel limited edition version of the card, 12 gigabytes of GDDR6. We're playing on the latest drivers and pairing with a 9800X 3D as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5. So this should clear any sort of CPU overhead problem, although I do think they actually addressed a lot of those issues. This should make sure our CPU is no issue for this card. And as always, I should mention this more, but there will be timestamps for every setting and resolution tested. I spent a lot of time going in making those timestamps, so please, if you're interested in just a particular setting or resolution, feel free to jump ahead. Let's hop in. All right, starting off here at 1080p, exclusive full screen, unlimited frame rate, and we're going to start off here at the extreme preset. So these are obviously max settings here. No frame generation, no upscaling, just completely maxed out, complete maxed out settings here at 1080p. All right, loading in here, this is completely maxed out 1080p settings, and you know, I kind of have like a loose definition of what I would consider to be a competitive frame rate in multiplayer games like this, multiplayer shooters, and that's typically around 120 FPS. So we're not quite at 120 FPS, though this is a very, very, you know, acceptable and smooth FPS. And really across all my testing, what I've noticed in this particular game is that, you know, even when the FPS is like slightly lower than maybe I'd want it to be, the 1% lows always seem to be pretty solid. So here you can see we're still getting like 72 on our 1% lows. Our average in the 90s, certainly acceptable, although not the highest. We will test some lower presets, but it is nice to see that at least we're at well above 60 FPS on our average here, using just under 10 gigabytes of video memory. So the video memory does not seem to be an issue in this particular case at 1080p, at least here. And this game is actually kind of interesting because I have noticed that it typically kind of just uses the same amount of video memory across a lot of different resolutions. So I'll be interested to see if it really uses much more than this, kind of like right around 10 gigabytes as we increase our resolution here in a minute. But yeah, in general here at max settings, certainly serviceable, not quite that 120, but really, really nice, smooth 90 plus FPS average. Now, before we start moving off of Ultra, we do, of course, have our upscaling options. And luckily, it does have XeSS built in, so we don't have to use FSR. XeSS, in my experience, works much better. So we'll go for balanced here. Probably want to go much lower than balanced at 1080p. And balanced here does give us a little bit worse of an image. I'll be honest, it is a little bit softer of an image, but does give us a pretty noticeable improvement to our FPS here. So nearly doubling our FPS, or maybe not quite that much, but giving us about, you know, another 60 FPS on top. And now we are really solidly into that competitive kind of range that again, there's no like real reason why 120 FPS is competitive compared to, you know, 90 or 60 or something like that. It's just kind of typically in my mind where I kind of think like, okay, this is going to be a really good experience. So certainly is really acceptable here, and our average went up to around 150, but what also came up, which is very noticeable and very smooth, is our 1% low is now above 100 FPS. So in general, really, really solid experience here. And, you know, if you are just looking for a little bit more FPS and don't really care about, you know, a slight softening of your image, certainly XeSS here at balance is a decent option for you. And you could go quality or ultra quality and get, you know, a little bit more mild of an improvement while retaining a bit better picture quality. I probably personally wouldn't go much lower than balanced here at 1080p. I do think that those options will be useful for us as we increase resolution, but probably 1080p is probably, I'd leave it right around here, but right around it balanced. Now, of course, rather than upscaling, our other option here, if we turn upscaling off, is just to bump down our settings. So if we were looking for a competitive 1080p option, we can go for the minimum preset here with upscaling turned off. Now, this did turn down our render resolution, oddly enough. So let's go ahead and make sure that that is correct. Just want to show that I'm doing this because I'm not sure if that showed our 50% resolution scale. But this is minimum settings at native 1080p resolution. And this is certainly a way to get a competitive like FPS. You can see we're kind of hovering right around 120 FPS, and the image itself looks really sharp, meaning that, you know, there's no upscaling going on, so it is rendering the pixels really well. Like the picture itself looks really clear, if that makes sense. But the minimum preset on this game is certainly minimum. So when you go ADS, you'll notice that the textures on our gun are very low, and shadows are also very, very like blocky, very rudimentary. But of course, this is a minimum preset, so it is meant for either people with lower end rigs or people who kind of just, say, I don't really need nice looking visuals. I just want to play the game at a competitive FPS and perform well. Either people who don't care or need the less intensive model here. So there's a few different reasons why maybe you might throw on this preset, and it is certainly doing what it's kind of intended to do here. And once again, it is also giving us a really solid 1% low, and that seems to be the case pretty much across all of our graphics options. Really staying consistent with the 1% lows, so right around 90. Is using quite a bit less video memory now, just under 5 gigabytes of video memory. So this is also where you might want to consider a more custom preset. So we could certainly come in here and just say like, okay, well, when I go ADS, maybe the textures being low, that's bothering me, or the shadows being low quality, that's bothering me. So you could come in and independently bump up some settings. So say, for example, you can see we're right around, we just kind of find a place to get a bit of a benchmark here. So stop counting here. So we're right around 145 FPS here, right? Now, if I were to come in here and just adjust, like, let's say just adjust our textures. So we throw on our high textures. We definitely have enough video memory. You can see it start to climb there all the way back up to around 10 gigabytes. We certainly have enough video memory, and you can see it doesn't really affect our FPS all that much. So if you did just kind of want to adjust some settings independently, you may get slightly lower FPS in some situations, but if it's not going to be super noticeable. And if you prefer to have that particular setting changed, because when you come down to certain objects, go prone, when you're going ADS, if those low resolution textures are bothering you, you certainly can, kind of individually adjust some of those things and kind of clean up some of those issues. And same thing goes for the shadows. You can come in and adjust that option as well. Shadows, I wouldn't say is as big of a deal. I don't really notice the shadows, just normal gameplay. The textures is really personally what I find to be the most noticeable for that minimum preset, that is. And the other option here, if we just go back to our stock minimum, hit apply here, is to use not only minimum, and this just our render resolution, which is super annoying here, but we'll go back to 100. So this is the minimum preset here, and the only thing I'm going to throw on now is go back and throw on that balanced XeSS. So this is using a combination of both, obviously, low graphics preset as well as some upscaling to achieve a high FPS. So you can see we are getting just about 200 FPS. Really solid, drops our video memory considerably, and there are other benefits of using upscaling aside from just increased FPS. It also does, given the increase in FPS, does improve your input latency, your response times, things like that. Some improvements there, as well as just in general, using upscaling has shown to kind of result in a little bit better response times. Not something that's going to be like night and day difference, but for a game like Call of Duty that is like very low time to kill, response times certainly do matter. Having, just even a just ever so slight difference is sometimes noticeable. So coming up all the way here to 200 FPS while retaining a pretty good looking picture. Again, when you use XeSS or upscaling at a resolution as low as 1080p, you are going to notice like a softening of your image, but it's not like the end of the world. It still looks pretty solid in my opinion. If you're asking me, I'd probably opt personally here, if I wanted high FPS, I'd probably opt for just the minimum preset with some of those adjustments being made, and either play at quality, ultra quality, upscaling, or even just native, because I do think that having that native picture is pretty nice. Now this doesn't look bad whatsoever, but just having those textures increase and not so much reliance on upscaling is probably where I'd personally land at. But I am kind of maybe a bit of a an edge case, because it seems that based on some comments I've get, that people play Call of Duty and these competitive games and they just want max FPS. I do want high FPS, but I also don't want terrible looking visuals. I do think that having the game look okay, like modern, is important enough to me to sacrifice a bit of FPS, but definitely to each their own, and you certainly have some options and you don't have to sacrifice too much to still get a very, very playable experience. All right, now moving up to 1440p. Starting off here, same thing at this extreme option. So this is our max, graphics option here. Again, not really something I think most people play at, but just to see what we can do here at native resolution. All right, so moving up here to 1440p now, and this is where you kind of begin to see the card kind of struggle a little bit. So we are, at least to begin with, kind of hovering around 60 FPS with you know, still pretty respectable 1% lows. I will say the 1% lows are still holding on pretty strong. The game is just well optimized. I mean, Call of Duty is a well optimized game. So even when you kind of are struggling with your FPS, surprisingly, it still kind of delivers the frames in a consistent enough manner that it's not really the end of the world. So if you were okay kind of hovering around 60 FPS, you certainly can get a decent experience here. Though, you know, while console 60 FPS is certainly, you know, most people would be happy with 60 FPS on console. I think most PC players have definitely come to, you know, the place where 60 FPS is really no longer what they want to be targeting. However, now that we are at 1440p, this is certainly where our upscaling options become a real benefit. So let's go for that XeSS balanced mode here, which at 1440p looks really great. I'm not going to say it looks native, but it does look considerably better than this same preset at 1080p. So still a lot of sharpness here, and now we're getting right around 95 FPS on our average with 71% lows. So still really, you know, great looking 1% lows, consistent frame times, some minor stutters here and there that we kind of are seeing on the frame time graph, but just as far as our actual experience playing the game, not too bad at all. So you can certainly play here at 1440p max settings with just a little bit of upscaling, get a pretty solid experience. Though I do think at 1440p we might need to test out a few more options than we kind of looked at 1080p. So this time, before going all the way down to minimum, let's actually just check out kind of a middle point here. We'll go back at native, and I will mention, I didn't mention before, but when upscaling is off, there's no anti-aliasing options in here, though I do believe that this game applies just a default TAA. There is anti-aliasing applied, even though it's not really giving you granular control over your anti-aliasing. So let's go for the balance preset here. So moving down here to the balance preset, it's kind of a way to reclaim a bit of that FPS while still playing at a native 1440p resolution. So you can see our 1% lows are incredible. I mean, to get a 88 FPS average with 70 for our 1% lows is an incredibly solid experience here. And as far as our, you know, video memory goes, still actually not using hardly any video memory, strangely enough. I don't know if some of that video memory, maybe it depends on what particular map that you're on. And in fact, I'm so curious here. Let me just make sure I am playing at our, yeah, we are at full resolution 1440p. So it's a bit surprising to me maybe that we are just not even using 7 gigabytes of video memory to achieve, you know, 60 plus FPS experience here at 1440p. But this game, you know, it does look pretty solid here. We'll go ahead and see if we can take a look at some textures. You can see kind of looking at our gun. Honestly, in my opinion, anything off of like the highest preset here does kind of result in some pretty not so great textures. And as far as like the shadows go, you can see it's still pretty blocky with our shadows even down here at balance. So, you know, maybe better off just going for that minimum preset, kind of just choose if you're going to go for, hey, I just want, you know, best possible experience FPS wise, or I want best possible graphics. I'm not sure that there really is a ton of refinement to be made, like going for a more middle of the road preset, because as you can see, like the shadows still have like this crazy blocky effect, and when we kind of go ADS, our gun still has a pretty low resolution texture on it, so it does seem to kind of basically look like we're playing at minimum settings here. But at this balance preset, getting around 80 FPS with 1% low, actually kind of not great here, showing 46, which is you know, indicative of a bit of a stuttery experience. Our frame time graph is a little bit, I won't say all over the place, but it's a little more unstable than we were seeing on some of our other presets. Now here, this is definitely a place where you can play and obviously perform. It's just about 60 FPS. Slightly more 80 FPS, it doesn't feel night and day difference. I really think when you start getting into like above 100 is where it starts to feel noticeably different. But let's go ahead and just throw on a bit of that XeSS, see if we can kind of achieve it through this means. So this is going for balanced for our graphics preset as well as balanced for our upscaling. So this is now where we are getting that competitive type experience, sitting right around 140 or so, 100 FPS on our 1% low. So this is a much more smooth experience here. Looks good. plays well. I will say I'd probably personally just go for the minimum preset, which I'll show in a moment here, just due to the fact that I do think minimum will give us a pretty significant boost to our FPS, and I don't actually think it looks all that much different. I don't think that this balance preset really looks that much better than minimum, so kind of feels weird trading off FPS for what I consider to be not super significant FPS gains, but definitely minimum here, or balance I should say. Definitely a doable preset here on our B580. So since we didn't really see much of a difference between balanced and minimum, let's check out minimum here at native resolution. All right, now here on the minimum settings at native resolution, I will mention too, I just noticed that I actually had the old overlay on. So if you notice that some of the UI was red, it's just due to the fact that I had you know, the old overlay from an AMD test on, but the overlay itself is just a visual effect overlay that's added. So it was still tracking the stats correctly and everything. I'll go ahead and make sure I overlay and add on a B580. It's just going to be probably a little sloppier than, you know, the official version, but regardless, you can see here on the minimum settings, of course, you know, we don't need to spend too much time on it. The shadows look, well, actually, it doesn't even look like we have shadows on this map too much, but if we do see shadows, textures, of course, here on the minimum preset, it does look pretty terrible, but, you know, it's kind of what you want in a way. Like, it's not super surprising that it does look too bad. As far as just, like, running around playing the game, of course, everything is normal. Like, you can still play the game, perform just as well as you can, if not better than all the higher presets. And we are now natively getting around 120 FPS. Like in some situations, you can see outdoors like this, we're getting 120. Average it like just under that, closer to 110. Some like, you know, action sequences, indoor, outdoor environments. You can see obviously there's some variation, but in general, very, very solid experience here. And this is native 1440p. So of course, given the fact that we are getting just under that 120 at native, if we do go ahead and enable just a little bit of our upscaling, so throwing on XeSS here, just leave it at balance here, which does look pretty solid as far as 1440p. Now you can see we are getting well above that 120 FPS target that we're kind of looking for. Now 1% lows here honestly are not that great, sitting right around 90. Kind of feels like a little bit of a choppy experience compared to some of our other tests at 1080p. Now this card is certainly a really great 1080p card, and when you do start pushing it past into, you know, 1440p, a lot of games that performed well, and I would, you know, obviously say this is performing well, but, you know, 1440p is definitely where you kind of have to begin using some of those tricks to make it work. But certainly 1440p is definitely on the table for the B580 in this game. And now finally moving up to 4K. Now this card in particular, 4K is really, you know, not something that you typically would want to do. I do, just because, you know, we tested the other settings, I do want to see what max settings on 4K even looks like. Obviously, I'm not expecting this to be a playable experience whatsoever, but let's take a look. So this is max settings, again, extreme, so at full render resolution, no upscaling. All right, so coming in here, 4K max settings. Shouldn't be super surprising. The only thing I do kind of want to call out here is if you take a look at our video memory, it's right about 10 gigabytes. So I don't know what it is. Call of Duty seems to not really change the video memory usage depending on resolution. Like, it's very, very similar, going from 1080p all the way up to 4K using less than a gigabyte of difference. We were seeing like just under 10 gigabytes at 1080p max settings, and now at 4K max settings, we're seeing just over 10 gigabytes. So it's very, very similar video memory usage, but obviously here, I mean, 40 FPS, honestly, it's better than I was expecting us to get, but certainly not a playable FPS here, at least at native. Now, of course, we do have upscaling, so let's just go ahead, throw on XeSS, and we'll crank it all the way to ultra performance. And maybe a bit surprising, but ultra performance XeSS is actually giving us a playable frame rate here at 4K. And this is really the magic of upscaling just in general. You know, the fact that this looks like a pretty convincing 4K image, and we are getting a high FPS, you know, definitely a playable FPS, well above 60 FPS, 1% lows in the 70s, averaging right around 100. And, you know, playing on a 4K monitor here, it does actually look like a convincing image. As we start increasing our resolution all the way up to 4K, it's really where upscaling looks much better. So really does look pretty solid here. Not really any complaints. I mean, if you had a 4K monitor and this was the GP that you had, and you typically just play lightweight games and you wanted to just hop into Call of Duty, the fact that you can crank the settings all the way up to extreme, and just throw on ultra performance XeSS and get a 60 plus FPS average, really impressive stuff here. And honestly, I wouldn't mind playing here really at all, as long as you're not playing like super competitively. You're gonna be having a pretty smooth experience, good 1% lows, solid looking picture. Really impressed with the performance here. Now, sticking with 4K, let's go ahead and I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but I do just want to test max settings and minimum settings here. So going down to minimum here, native resolution at 4K. And now over here on the minimum preset, honestly, not that huge of a performance increase. And certainly some of the things that, I even complained about being noticeable at lower resolutions are even more noticeable now at 4K. Things like the low quality textures. So, I probably wouldn't go for the minimum preset just right off the bat. It seems to be that the bottleneck here is not so much the graphic settings, and much more the actual resolution itself. Being our bottleneck. So due to the fact that it's not the graphics that are really like the graphics options or the textures that are really the bottlenecks, you can see we're only using just under 6 gigabytes of video memory. It doesn't really make a ton of sense to sacrifice so much when it comes to those graphic settings, especially at 4K where you are likely playing on a larger monitor. Some of these issues or lower quality visuals are more and more noticeable. Looking at our gun, things like that, I mean, it just looks like we're playing COD Mobile almost. So probably wouldn't go for this particular preset, but just to see, we'll go ahead and stop counting. Obviously, the last thing we kind of have here, if we just wanted maximum possible FPS, is to just drop the settings all the way down and crank the upscaling all the way up. And you can see this does certainly give us a higher FPS than we were getting at extreme, though it's honestly not that different. We were getting like around 100 FPS at extreme, and now we're getting like around 130, which is, it's noticeable, the FPS increase. But what is far more noticeable, in my opinion, here is certainly the downgrade as far as our visuals go. The shadows, all blocky, textures look pretty subpar. So I do think that those differences are far more noticeable than, the added little bit of FPS that we're getting as a result here. So I would probably opt for either, that extreme preset, or, the other thing we could do, may as well check out here, is kind of just coming in and manually tweaking some things. So first thing, texture resolution, bumping that up to high. And then the other thing is the shadows. So taking shadows here from very low up to ultra. So if we apply these settings, the game looks much better. But now we're essentially getting pretty close to what we were at our extreme preset. So kind of picking and choosing exactly what maybe bothers you, what you would kind of prioritize, might be a bit of a better option here. So now we are, able to go ADS, look at our gun, have high quality textures. And when we go and run around shadows, those big blocky shadows, like all pixelated looking shadows, aren't really going to be quite as noticeable. So it's pretty impressive that you can come in here and get, 100 plus FPS at a really good looking 4K image with pretty, solid looking visuals. I'd say is a pretty great, thing to see here. Anyways, guys, that's been it. The B580 on Call of Duty Black Ops 7. In general, pretty impressed with the performance here. No surprise, 1080p is really great. 1440p is doable. And what surprised me the most, I guess, if anything, is just how doable even 4K is. Just in practice that we are able to get a pretty convincing looking 4K image, good looking visuals at a competitive or somewhat competitive FPS is pretty nice to see. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.